So as a driving instructor, we hear lots of different things with regards to the myths around why people haven't passed a driving test. And you'd be amazed at what people come up with. So in this video, what I want to do is go through the common ones that I hear and give you the reasons why it's actually a myth. So let's start with touching the curb. So everybody seems to think that touching the curb is an instant fail. And it's not. If you're manoeuvring and you just so happen to just brush the curb, then that would be a minor. It'd be a driving fault. However, if you hit that curb at speed, so let's imagine we're going down a road at 40 or 50 miles an hour and you accidentally go too close and you hit that at speed, then the chances are the examiner will want to stop the car and examine the wheels to make sure it's still roadworthy, and in that case you would fail. But just a gentle brush of the curb, no, not on a manoeuvre. Even when you're putting into park, that would just simply be a minor or a driving fault. However, if you mounted the curb, then that's a different story. If you were going down a road and the driving examiner turns around to you and says, okay, I'd like you to pull up and stop on the left hand side please, and all the cars down the road were parked up on the curb and you did exactly the same thing without the correct signage, then you would fail. But just touching the curb won't lead you to fail the driving test. The second one is coasting. I hear it a lot. Oh, I can't coast. And yes, no, it's good driving practice not to coast. However, in certain circumstances, it's not going to be a driving fault. For example, if you're in a car park and you need to move the car slowly, then we might need to coast, because we'll need the car to go slower than the gearing will allow. So we're just going to simply push that clutch in to give us more control over that car. However, if we were coming off of a slip road, for example, off of a main road down onto a slip road, and that went down a hill to a set of traffic lights, and you pushed the clutch down 300, 400 yards before the traffic lights, and you were doing 60 miles an hour, and you push that clutch down, because it's going to take a lot longer for you to slow that car and the car's not under control, that would probably lead you to having a fail. Okay, so not necessarily, but it depends on whether the examiner feels the car is under control or not. But slow stuff, by all means, push that clutch down and let's coast the car, because we need to control the car on the slow stuff. Another one people always say is, oh, I'll book my driving test at rush hour. I'll just sit in traffic. It's going to be so easy. And that's not really the case. If it was, everybody would be taking it at rush hour. Examiners know their areas inside out. They know it really, really well. They know where the traffic's going to lie at certain times of the day. So they have routes that will avoid the traffic. So you won't sit in traffic all the time. You won't. It won't be feasible for them to do it, because they've only got 45 minutes to do a test. So you can book one in rush hour, but it's not going to be an easy one. Okay? And you certainly won't fail for it. Going too slow. Now, this is another interesting one that everybody seems to think is a reason for failing. So, going too slow. Well, it's making progress. Okay, so let's imagine you come out of a say road and you're emerging onto a main road. In that instance, we need to pick the speed up, because if we're going to impact on a car travelling up the road, if we pulled out in front of them and we start going really slow, then that may be a problem. Okay. However, if we've got coming up to a roundabout or a junction, or there's something happening, a developing hazard, for example, then we need to be slow in that instance. So not necessarily going slow is wrong. Okay, so don't get too caught up with, am I going too slow or am I going too fast? Drive to the conditions of the road. Drive to what's in front of you. If there's a developing hazard, we're going to be slow. But if it's a straight piece of road with nothing to hinder us, then we can sit at the speed limit. So rolling back's another one. Okay, so you're sitting on a hill, need to do a hill start, and the car rolls back. Now, that's not necessarily a fail. Could be a minor. All depends on how far you roll back and the situation you're in. So if you've got a car behind you that's really close behind you, and you allow the car to roll back, then potentially that could fail you. However, if you're sitting on a hill and you just roll back a little bit and there was nothing behind you and it's perfectly safe, and you stop the car, regain control, then that wouldn't be a minor. Okay, so rolling back isn't necessarily a fail either. Handbrake. Interesting one. If you don't use a handbrake when you stop in traffic, people seem to think that is going to be a fail. Now, this is dating back to when I passed the driving test. So when we were in traffic, we'd always have to use the handbrake to make the car safe. If we didn't, then it could be an issue. However, nowadays, it's all about, and bearing in mind modern cars haven't got the old style handbrake, we've now got the parking brakes that are electronic. Things have changed and evolved, like everything. So now, you're not expected to use the handbrake all the time. So therefore, I teach my pupils to use their feet to hold the car and control the car with the pedals. That then demonstrates control to the examiner. But you don't need to use the handbrake all the time. So if you don't use the handbrake, you're going to fail. Well, that's not the case. Okay, you can. I've had people go around the whole test and haven't put the handbrake on once. So by all means, use the handbrake if you need to, if you're on a hill. But if not, don't use it. If you've got other ways of controlling the car, do so. Mirrors. Now here's the good one. Okay, so everybody seems to think you're going to fail if you don't constantly check your mirrors all the time. But that's not the case. Okay, so in the DVSA handbook and in the highway code, it says you should make effective observations. Now, what that means is that you need to make observations when you need to make them. So, if I'm driving down the road and I'm constantly looking at my mirrors, I'm not looking ahead at what's happening ahead. I'm not concentrating on the road ahead. I'm not seeing everything because I'm too busy worrying about what's happening behind me. Don't get me wrong, you do need to know what's behind you. But in this instance, let's use the mirrors when we need to use them. So that is when we're changing direction. So if we're turning left, turning right, or we're changing speed. So if we're speeding up, coming into a new speed zone, so I'm going from 30 maybe to a 50, I'm going to check my mirrors to see what's coming down my right hand side, to see if there's a car over or a motorbike overtaking me. And if I'm slowing down, how close is the car behind? Do I need to consider how slowly I bring that speed down? So don't go around thinking that you've got to check your mirrors all the time, because that's not what the examiners want. The examiners want you to use your mirrors when you need to use them. So going the wrong way on a driving test. Everybody seems to think that's one of the myths for failing the driving test, and it's not. Okay, you can go the wrong way on a driving test. Things happen. At the end of the day, you might come up to a roundabout and you might accidentally pick the wrong lane. And in that case, it might be better to go round maybe to the left rather than trying to create a dangerous manoeuvre and bring the car to the right. So there's no place on the sheet for them to mark, the driving examining sheet, for them to mark you down as going the wrong way. However, if you consistently do it, then the driving examiner may take a dim view of that and they may fail you for it. So don't be worried if you go the wrong way. Just admit you made a mistake and they'll just guide you back to where they want you to be. So they know the road network really well, so they'll use the road to bring you back to where they want to be. The next myth, stalling. Okay, so you're going to be nervous on the driving test. You're going to stall, or the chances are higher you're going to stall. Okay, I've had people that haven't stalled for many hours before their driving test, go on a driving test and they'll stall it a couple of times. And it's the nerves that get to you. And the examiners know that, and they get that, and they understand it. So stalling is not necessarily going to mean that you fail. It might mean you get a driving fault from time to time if you consistently do it. And if you do it even more, they may fail you for it. because control of the car. However, where they will fail you for stalling is if you stall in a dangerous situation. So for example, let's say we're on a dual carriageway coming up to a roundabout, and we stop and we let the traffic come through and we spot our gap and we go move the car, and suddenly we stall, and half the car is now on a live dual carriageway roundabout. That is where it will be deemed dangerous, and therefore you'll fail. But just generally stalling shouldn't lead you to fail. I hear this a lot, and the next myth's all to do with reverse cameras and sensors. So on your driving test, you're going to get asked to do a number of manoeuvres, and I have pupils that want to practice without the reverse camera and without the sensors, and that's fine. I get that, because let's face it, when you pass your driving test, 9 times out of 10, if you're a 17-year-old, the car you buy will not have a rear-facing camera. So it's good practice to be able to park a car without using a camera. However, on driving test, it's not a fail if you use the facilities in the car. So if I've got a reversing camera on it, use it. It's there. It's like saying, well, you can't use the mirrors because the mirrors are an aid, so you're not allowed to use the mirrors as well. They're never going to say that. So therefore, if you have a reverse camera, use it. Steering. Now, here's the big one, and this is the one that I hear from a lot of people that then go out to practice with mum and dad. Okay, so when I passed the driving test 30 odd years ago, you were not allowed to cross your hands. You had to push and pull, feed that steering wheel through the hands. That's the way we were taught to steer. We had to keep our hands at 10 to 2 or quarter to 3. We weren't allowed to drive with one hand off the steering wheel. However, nowadays, as long as the examiner feels the car's under control, you can turn that steering wheel however you like. So you can cross your arms. You can even roll it with one arm, palm it round. However, I still prefer 2 hands on the steering wheel because you've got greater control. You don't have to have your hands at 10 to 2. You could have your hands down in your lap. But realistically, if you think about it, if anything happens, you're not going to have the control that you would have up here. So it's a really good idea to have your hands at 10 to 2 or quarter to 3, because this is where the hands really should be. And if you look at my steering wheel, it's designed because here is for somewhere to rest my thumbs. So this is where the designers want my hands. So therefore, let's keep our hands at 10 to 2. However, if you accidentally put your hands in your lap, or maybe drive with one hand on the gear stick and one hand here, it's fine, as long as the car remains under control. And the final one, the biggest myth of all, the one that makes me laugh every time I take people to test, and that is, I failed my driving test because the examiner has used up all his passes for the week. Why would an examiner have a quota to pass people? They have a quota that they have to fulfill, regards to how many turns, how many roundabouts, how many manoeuvres they perform, but they haven't got a quota for how many people they can pass. It just makes no sense. They're there to pass you. They don't want to fail you. If you're dangerous, then they will, because that's their job. They're there to maintain standards. However, they're not there to break everybody's heart, and they're not nasty people. They're people like you and me, and they don't like it when they make people cry. And I've seen people cry because they failed them. And who wants a job like that? Who wants to go into work and make people fail? Nobody. So they don't have a quota for passes. They have quotas for other things, but not for passes. So if you failed your driving test, it's because you made a mistake in your control of the car or the way you reacted to something in front of you. It's not because the examiner has run out of passes for the week. So I hope that video has given you a good understanding of the myths behind why people supposedly fail their driving test, and hopefully it's given you more clarification on what is allowed and what isn't allowed. But whatever you do, just make sure that you keep yourself safe, you take as much learning as you possibly can from your lessons, and more importantly, you enjoy your driving.